Hello, and welcome to the first webinar in our series, Synodality in Perspective, Traditions Past and Present. My name is David Albertson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Nova Forum for Catholic Thought at the University of Southern California. Together with the Lumen Christi Institute and the American Kuzana Society, my fellow co-organizers, we're starting off today with the first of 6 conversations with historians and theologians about the meaning of what Pope Francis calls the path of synodality. As we all look toward the Synod on Synodality in Rome in October 2023, we hope these dialogues can help us learn more about the past to better understand the global future of the Catholic Church. Public events like this one reach large audiences, both live as today and after they're archived on YouTube for others to discover. All of our programs depend on your support. If you would like to support Nova Forum, please go to our website at novaforum.org and follow us on social media. Help us make the Catholic intellectual tradition a living presence in the modern university by making a gift at novaforum.org/donate. My role today is to introduce our moderator, who will in turn introduce our 2 scholars in conversation. Dr. Nathan Tilley received his PhD from Duke University, specializing in early Christianity. His research studies Eastern Christian literature, asceticism, and ancient philosophy. Last year, Dr. Tilley was a junior fellow in Byzantine studies at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. He also holds degrees from Notre Dame and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We're delighted to welcome him to Synodality in Perspective. Nate, you can unmute yourself, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I'm looking forward to a rich set of presentations and the conversation afterwards. And I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but I first want to offer a few comments about the scope of this session. This first webinar in the Synodality in Perspective series is entitled Synodality in Ancient Christian Tradition. This title, as many of you will know, offers something of a useful anachronism. Synods are, of course, quite ancient, as we'll hear this evening, but the term synodality is of recent vintage. This neologism and concept emerges in the late 20th century in order to point beyond this or that synod or council to a broader theological concept of communion, and more profoundly, to the communion of all humanity and union with the Trinity through the Church. Though the term arose explicitly in Catholic theology only recently, modes of ecclesial communion are, of course, quite ancient. And historical inquiry, for this reason, plays an important role in defining the meaning of synodality, and this for at least 2 reasons that I want to briefly enumerate. First, many of the contemporary writings on synodality locate the roots of this phenomenon in the early church. The first centuries of the church saw bishops, priests, and even sometimes laity began practices of meeting and deliberating about church matters that would structure the church's life for centuries. While the all too human proceedings of these synods don't always cohere with the ideals that contemporary concepts of synodality put forward, they do offer the first outlines of the form. And as a result then, second, these historical explanations are an act of discernment. Pope Francis speaks often, drawing on his Jesuit heritage, of the value of discernment, of listening and attending to the particular, and not predetermining the topic of conversation or the topics for decision. Though discernment frequently means regional listening, it can also take a historical mode. The variable ground of history, with all of its intractable particularity, doesn't offer just the confirmation of a concept, or here's synodality in the past, but actually engagement with history brings us face to face with the living phenomenon itself and can thus shape the meaning of the concept of synodality in our time. So with these items in view, I want now to turn to our 2 distinguished panelists. We are delighted to have with us tonight for our first presentation, Dr. Robin Darling-Young. Dr. Darling-Young is Associate Professor of Church History at the Catholic University of America. She has published and lectured widely on topics in the history of early Christianity and its thought, including on scriptural interpretation, the history of asceticism and monastic thought, the Christian cultures of ancient Syria and Armenia, and many more topics. Dr. Darling Young's most recent publication is an edition and translation of the Armenian version of the Letters of Evagrius Ponticus with Father Hovsep Karapetyan, out very soon from Peters Publishing. With the translation team, she's also finishing the very long work of producing English translations from the Greek and Syriac texts of the same author's Gnostic trilogy for Oxford University Press. Our second speaker is Dr. Christopher M. Bellitto. Dr. Bellitto is professor of history at Kean University in New Jersey, where he teaches courses in ancient and medieval history. A specialist in the Middle Ages, church history, and reform, he is the author of 10 books and over 30 articles and book chapters published in the United States and Europe. He has twice won grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and in summer 2019, he was a Fulbright specialist at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. And he was a visiting scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary in 2021 to 2022. Dr. Bellitto also serves as series editor-in-chief of Brill's Companions to the Christian Tradition and an academic editor-at-large for Paulus Press. He's also a frequent public speaker and has taped audio courses for many different settings, and is a media commentator on church history and contemporary Catholicism, frequently appearing in print, radio, and television. We're delighted to hear both of these scholars speak and to talk together. And so without further ado, Robin, you can unmute yourself and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nathan. So I'm going to talk about the age of the ecumenical councils in early Christianity, or more rather what leads up to them. So the age of the ecumenical councils is the 4th to the 6th century. But how did these get going? Any historian of early Christianity and its organization begins with a question. How did such and such form of life, of which we have some kind of records, develop in early Christianity? We can ask the question of official ministers, of ceremonies, of books of various kinds, and of forms of life, such as notably the ascetic life, or the philosophical life, or the tradition of pilgrimage or veneration of saints. We can ask questions about forms of life and structure that appeared at one time and then later disappeared. For instance, the female diaconate, or the practice of syneisactism, male and female ascetics living together in a household chastely. Examples could be multiplied. For the use of in the governance and organization of the church. The records are, ironically, organized. Where did they take place? The institution of the Eucharist, or the that occur according to the Gospels, the office of bishops, presbyters, and deacons mentioned in later letters of the New Testament and first century documents. Did the synod or council begin as a result of the reading of scripture? Maybe, but certainly not as a result of a direct order by Jesus. Yet early Christianity, as a movement at first within Judaism, of course, had conflicts and questions. And as I'll describe later, it organized, or is recorded to have organized, a synod in Jerusalem very early, but not at the explicit direction of Jesus, of course, because he was no longer alive at the time, at least on earth. Here is where, especially as it separates from Judaism, Christian leaders, first in the Greek-speaking world, then in the Latin world, turn to public models of decision-making in order to solve problems that always arise in human communities. So the practice and concept of the synod, synodos, Greek, or concilium, Latin, means the same thing, begins in the cities of the ancient world, either with a centralizing monarchical government or without it. The chief social unit beyond that of the household and its family was the town or city. These places in turn required an organization of what we would call services, markets, water supply, domestic and defensive structures, maintenance of internal order depending upon courts of law, even guard houses, not prisons, but temporary jails. With or without a monarch present or distant, cities and their surrounding countrysides in the ancient world had an assembly of reliable adult males, free males, well-educated and responsible enough to handle the internal and external relations of the city. Most people know about the Athenian assembly, the Greek word for which significantly is ekklesia, a word that we translate as church, thanks to the New Testament. This term is significant, and it should be remembered because already in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it translates kahal, the group of those called to the local assembly. Another word for which, of course, is synagoge or synagogue, a word which morphs into ecclesia in the New Testament to signify what is later termed church. These terms overlap, and it's significant, the synagogue, with a ruling council of elders to manage the life of the assembly, is a crucial feature of communal life, especially as it expands upon throughout the Greco-Roman world. There are references, obviously, to elders in the letters of Paul and to ecclesiae, churches, but there are still no references to synod. Now, in the Greek world, the ecclesia was the assembly for governing something. In a sense, for governing a city was therefore a politeia, which is a really interesting word for early Christianity. It sometimes means a constitution, written or unwritten, and as such, it shows up in the writings of Plato and Aristotle, the foundation of much later Greek thought, including early Christian thought, likewise the foundation of Latin thought. And this politeia has to do with how the affairs of a community should be organized as distinct from the affairs of a single human being or family, usually termed household. But politeia means both a structure and the entire assembly of the members, high and low. And it should be remembered here that in the ancient world, as well as in early Christianity, there was a very distinct and hierarchical social structure. So in case anybody wonders where that comes from in the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox Church, there's your answer. Now, early Judaism in the Hellenistic period, centered as it was on Jerusalem, unsurprisingly regarded itself as a city or polis whose citizens were to some degree responsible for running the business of the city. Early Christianity also, because it developed as a strand within Judaism before separating during the 1st and 2nd centuries, also understood itself as an ecclesia and a politeia, and therefore as a city, both below here on earth and above in heaven, with a governance, at least on earth, requiring officials, much like the synagogue from which it had emerged, and much, of course, like the secular, or, well, secular isn't a good word, like the non-Christian cities where Christianity lived. Beginning in the 2nd century, Christian church synods or councils, again from the Latin concilium, took as their model the form, order, and record keeping of Roman state councils. And that's why you should be seeing on your slideshow here, scribes. Scribes are crucial for the development of the synod. And these Roman state councils at the urban level depended upon scribes. Later, city councils reported to imperial officials, and they set the pattern for local governance, aiming for harmony with imperial command. Of course, this varies from place to place and time to time, but it's a general picture. At the same time, church councils gave a place of honor to the copies of the written authority for their gathering, the scriptures, regarded as theopneustos in Greek, or divinely inspired. They looked back in some cases, to an earlier form of the Synod, the Great Assembly of the Second Temple Judaism, but more importantly, the Council of Jerusalem. You can check Acts 15, 1-35 in the year approximately 50, which itself has as a precedent the gathering of apostles and disciples at Pentecost, a Jewish feast to mark the passage of 7 weeks after the Passover. In the period when early Christianity began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, early Christians began to imitate the institutions of the government of that empire. Those who attended councils in the empire, and here I mean councils of the empire, not councils of the church, were often trained in rhetoric and sometimes in philosophy. They were highly educated males and were prominent in their cities or regions. So you could advance the slide to the next one, which will show you a far-flung, from the Roman perspective, practice of the scribal practice, Ethiopia, where it still survives, as you can see. And then in the next slide, Armenia, which I want to mention a little bit later. Now, in theory, Christian councils in late antiquity were guided by the Spirit. They were responsible to the rule of bishops. They usually kept narratives or minutes of their deliberations and decisions. And here you see a depiction of Armenian scribes with their assistants offering them ink pots. So you can see how professionalized this aspect of the council is. Now, early Christian councils created precedents upon which all later councils could build. And those precedents continued even among those churches that after the 3rd century separated from what I'm going to call the imperially sponsored ecclesiastical body. That would be the Latin church in the West and the Greek-speaking church in the East. So there are records of the proceedings of many of these synods, both Latin, Greek, Armenian, Syriac, but there are records by no means of all of them. All would have had extensive prior discussions of whatever matters needed attention before issuing decisions or decrees that would be stored in a repository of some sort forwarded to a larger repository. One of the ways in which the Bishop of Rome, whose successor, of course, is our own dear Francis, became centrally powerful was by collecting the minutes and decrees of local synods. But there were also essential personnel involved in synods, and these all depended upon the common educational system of the Greco-Roman Empire, known in Greek as paideia. That these were people trained in the standard skills of imperial government meant that already the form and contents of synods in Christian regions would resemble those in the part of the social and political world that was not Christian. Note that if they were trained specifically for courtroom and government service, they would also have had to have mastered Latin, so there's a certain amount of bilinguality there. Roman Empire. These synods or councils would have taken place in town halls, buildings very similar to the buildings of the Christian ecclesia, i.e. churches, and upon which the standards design of the church may have been modeled with some modifications, interestingly. So this interweaving of church and the Roman political realm is already taking place, and in part thanks to synods in the 2nd and 3rd century. As I've said already, they required scribes and stenographers like our Armenian friends here, who were trained in fast writing, tachygraphy, and on certain public occasions would have been male. I want to add that there were female scribes in early Christianity, but they only operated privately as far as we know. Now, I'm going to briefly review selected features from 4 examples of pre-Constantinian councils to show how they set a precedent for the ecumenical councils, that is, worldwide Christian councils that began in 325 at Nicaea near the new imperial capital of Constantinople. These are the synods that took place in Asia Minor in the 170s to 180s dealing with Montanism. The synod represented in Origen's dialogue with Heraclides, the Council of Carthage under Cyprian the bishop in 257, and the Synod of Antioch in 269 that deposed the flamboyant bishop Paul of Samosata. In each of these, bishops, assisted by lay experts, laid down important precedents that shaped later churches. And I want to note here that the only example of a synod with regular participation of lay people is the Armenian Synod, beginning with what is called in Armenian the Ashtishat Rov in 324, called by Nerses the Catholicos of the Armenian Church. This set a precedent to which, perhaps of regular inclusion of lay people in church synods. I want to say also that the main source for our knowledge of early councils is the church history of Eusebius of Caesarea, the inescapable historian of early Christianity. Though he was writing in the 4th century and his discussion of the councils is anachronistic, he does quote from documents beginning in the 2nd century, which show how urgent matters. They also show how the council's remit began to expand from locality to a much wider region. So, Eusebius mentioned 170s and 180s asking for a hypomnema, a memorandum, to deal with the alleged the Montanists, otherwise known as the New Prophecy. And the result was an encyclical letter that gave a summary, but did not report the discussion. We're really lacking the details of many of the discussions of these councils. The next one I want to mention is Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, dies 258. He has letters which have been preserved reporting. Okay, there were already synods in North Africa about 20 years before Cyprian, and Cyprian himself followed the practice of his predecessors. In particular, a council of 256 reports an address by Cyprian and 87 individual statements of bishops. And perhaps you could advance the slide at this point so we can see what that might have been like. Okay, just note it when it comes out. The next council, that's a little bit out of place. That shows the emperor, but that anticipates actually the role of the emperor in the council. Thank you. This is what I wanted to show, which actually is the illustration of a medieval discussion, but it does illustrate the torrent of words that would come out in a council. Okay, so the next council I want to discuss is the dialogue with Heraclides, which is answers by the great philosopher theologian Origen, who examines and refutes the opinions of a bishop who was completely outgunned. Eusebius in the church history mentions another similar council in which Origen was the terrifying expert brought in to interrogate somebody under Beryllus, the bishop of Bostra in Arabia. And finally, an example of which deposed Paul of Samosata. He was bishop of the city of Antioch, which still survives as Antakya, Turkey.
Excuse me, Robin. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you just go back? You cut out for a minute or so when you introduced this last council.
Sorry, I always blame this on governmental authorities in Washington interfering with my internet. Did I talk about the dialogue with Heraclides? Is that done?
Yes, you just turned to the last council.
Okay. So finally, the bishop, Paul of Samosata, who gathers 70 bishops from Egypt to the Black Sea. So a very large group from a wide geographical area. And they deposed him from his episcopal see because of his unacceptable views and his shady personal life. All four councils show already the practice that would be deployed at Nicaea of discussions, most of which are not recorded, and of the recording of the decisions of councils, including theological opinions, which then become dogmata, teachings, and finally, decisions that are called canons, rules of life, that are then compiled and reaffirmed in later councils. This is how councils in early Christianity developed and began to work. And I can recommend two titles if you would like to know more. A recent book by Thomas Grauman, The Acts of the Early Church Councils, Production and Character, that's 2021, and Ramsey McMullen's intriguingly titled Voting About God in the Early Church, in Early Church Councils, and that's in 2006. Okay, that is the end of my presentation, and I think that it's time to pass it on to my colleague, Professor Bellitto.
Thank you. It's really humbling to follow Dr. Darling-Young. I can't hope to replicate the scope and depth of her learning. I'm going to share my screen here in a moment. What I would like to say is my goal here is to kind of give the view from 35,000 feet on councils and synods, and to talk a bit about some of the early tensions from those early councils and how they continue to play out in what we're undergoing now in this 3-year synodal process. So a little back to the future, if I may. So if I am going to do this properly, and I'm hoping someone will come in and tell me that we're doing it properly. Can you see my screen there?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so let me begin by saying that a synod is not a general council. In giving talks, so I'm here in New Jersey, my home diocese is the Diocese of Trenton, and in speaking with various groups, I think a number of people think that we're gearing up for a Vatican III, and we certainly are not gearing up for a Vatican III. So let me begin by saying that a synod is not a general council. A synod are all the meetings that Dr. Darling-Young have been talking about that gear up, that feed into, intentionally or not, to a general council. So when I did my own book on the general council, typically they're taught, you hear 21 councils, you think, well, 21 centuries, there's a general council per century. Not true. So when I did my own book, I kind of grouped them in the way that you see there, because the first 6 councils are really one big council, in that they're answering the logical questions that come up as various creeds come through. So you see also that I'm recommending the book Voting About God. If nothing else, if C-SPAN had been around during the early church, Ramsey McMullen would have been the color commentator. It is a book full of color and full of life and full of all sorts of insights, such as bishops fighting with each other, the near violence of certain moments, bishops not being incredibly well educated about certain topics, and that leading to trouble as well. So between just the first and the fifth general councils, that is from 325 to 553, there were 250 larger regional meetings, and those larger regional meetings would have been the result of, fed into, by many more local synods as well. Now, at one point, Ramsay MacMullen speculates as many as 15,000, a wildly optimistic number. But if people were following the rules and having a synod twice a year as they were supposed to, that's where he gets to the number 15,000. The point for those who are afraid that Francis is leading to introducing some great innovation into the church, that line is nonsense. It's absolutely false. He's going back to the way decisions used to be made. And instead of talking about bottom up or top down, I think we should talk about periphery to the center to the periphery again. We've just celebrated Mother Teresa's feast day, a perfect example of someone from a periphery who brought issues to the center, and those issues went out to other peripheries as well. And I think that that's what Francis is trying to do. And that replicates the way the early church started to say, once Christianity becomes legal and then the only religion in the Roman Empire, bishops begin to ask, well, what words do you use to describe the fact that Mary is the mother of God? How do you figure it out? And then all of those people come together, and then they feed from the periphery to the center. A very decentralized way, because it's not until Leo comes along and Leo says in 450, your decisions at these councils are really not binding until I say they are binding. And people shouted at that Council of Chalcedon, Peter has spoken through Leo. So this continues in the Middle Ages, even though the Middle Ages was a period of centralization for the papacy. We talk about the very word papatus appearing not out of nowhere, but certainly a lot more after the year 1050. You had these local synods. So from 500 to 900, we can count 60 in Central Europe. And those were leading up to and coming out of Charlemagne's centralization. Charlemagne, of course, crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. So this is his way of promulgating decisions. And then dozens between 1050 and 1123. I'm always careful about using statistics because I remember Mark Twain's line that there are three types of lies, damn lies, and statistics. But a remarkable number comes during the period of Pope Paschal II. In his 19-year papacy, he had 16 synods, nearly one a year. That tells you how important they were. That tells you how common they were. That tells you how accepted they were. And we should remember this as we move into the current period in our own time. Innocent III, even though he's calling here for a general council, gives an example of how this was working in the Middle Ages. So in April 1213, he sends out an announcement that says, hey, we're going to meet in Rome 2.5 years from now in November 1215. And as part of that announcement, he said something very similar to what Pope Francis is saying now. Meanwhile, between now and then, October 2023 for us now, meanwhile, ask around, see what people are talking about. Or as Innocent III said, meantime, both personally and by discreet agents, you will inquire precisely about all matters which seem to call for energetic correction of reform, and, conscientiously writing a report, you will deliver it for the scrutiny of the Sacred Council. Innocent knew what he wanted to talk about, but he also wanted to know what he was missing. He wanted to know what other people were talking about. If one diocese is talking about something and no one else is, then it's a local matter. But if dozens of dioceses are asking similar questions, then it's a matter that calls for regional and indeed general attention. Just very briefly, because we are talking here in an American setting, although I hope we do have an international audience, there have been plenary councils, we might call them synods, on the national level. There were 3 in Baltimore. If you remember, Baltimore competes with St. Augustine St. Augustine as the primatial see in the United States. 3 meetings very close together, 1852, 66, and 84 in Baltimore, though we note that these were bishop-only meetings. We think that in the early church, where the line between laity and clergy was not always clear, that lay people were involved as well, and certainly lay people are going to be involved in the synods that is upcoming. And there were also 7 locally in Baltimore alone during that period. So what is the current code of canon law on synods? I'm kind of breaking the rule that I tell my students. Don't put a lot of words on your slides and don't read them. But I'm trusting that I'm putting these up so that you might jot down to easily look up, Google Catholic Code of Canon Law. You will easily be taken to the Vatican website, and you can look up these particular canons or paragraphs. A canon is typically a paragraph, sometimes several paragraphs. But I want to highlight in red, these are my highlights, highlight in red what the current Code on Canon Law says on synods. Its job is to consider questions pertaining to the activity of the church in the world, and interestingly, to discuss the questions, not to resolve them or issue decrees about them unless in certain cases the Roman pontiff has endowed it with deliberative power, in which case he ratifies the decisions of the synod. It is the job of the bishops and other people he appoints, including lay people, male and female, to discuss things, but once those decisions are made, once there's a consensus, that is not law until the Roman pontiff says that it's law. So there's a tension there between periphery and center, again, dating back to the early church. The Synod of Bishops is under the Roman pontiff. It is the Roman pontiff who defines the agenda. And that's what's key here. And that's what's different, because Francis's agenda, like partially Innocent III's agenda, was to ask, what do you want the agenda to be? What topics do you want to talk about? And so continuing in the next few canons, canon law says that the Bishop of Rome can call a special session, and it might be on a particular topic or it might be on a particular region. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce some of those. Most of the people who are coming are bishops, but others will be appointed directly by the Roman pontiff. So how did this play out in modernity? So Paul VI kind of woke up the Synod of Bishops in 1965 at the conclusion of Vatican II as a way of continuing the process. And what flowed out of Vatican II was kind of the things that people recognized needed to be done at Vatican II, but needed more time. So for instance, in the first Synod of Bishops in 67, he called for a new code of canon law, from which we have just been looking. And he established the International Theological Commission. And then the next 3 were thematic: justice, social teaching, evangelization, and catechesis. Under John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and over time, these being very centralizing, even monarchical bishops of Rome, they went away from the periphery to the center to more a reception of Vatican directives. The people who were most critical of John Paul II said that while the bishops were speaking in the Synod of Bishops, he was reading something, and what he was reading was the final statement which he had written even before they had shown up. Though I think he had things that he wanted to say, I think he was listening as well. So you can see that John Paul II had 15 in 27 years, and he tended to focus on regions. Benedict XVI, 5 synods in 8 years, both topics and regions. So under Francis, he's had 5 on the family, young people, the Amazon. And what's really different about Francis is that he was moving away from that centralizing top-down tendency, and he wanted people to speak freely. In fact, he said in October 2014, using a Greek word, "Speak clearly, let no one say, 'This can't be said. They will think this or that about me.'" One must say everything that one feels boldly, and he used the Greek word, parrhesia. So his style is very much, as Dr. Tilley said at the beginning, one of Jesuit discernments. And so the Synod on Synods is, in essence, a group discernment. Francis has been described as seeing his role as the world's spiritual director. Of course, very well known is the Undersecretary of the Synod, who will be voting. I believe she's going to be speaking in our program, Sister Natalie, in a few weeks. So let's finish with the documents connected to this synod so that we can have time for questions and conversation. This is not a synod that says we're going to talk about topic X. It's the exact opposite. Francis's agenda is not to have an agenda. It's a worldwide consultation asking, what do God's people want to talk about, especially people whose voices have not been heard. The laity, especially women, marginalized group, and from smaller places. But the big question that everyone has that has not been answered is an important decision in canon law. Will they have a deliberative voice, that is a vote that counts, or a consultative voice, an opinion that can be heard or ignored? This, at the moment, is an open question. And so in this document that was put out, the sense is that the church is on a pilgrim journey. One of the most important teachings Yves Congar said about Vatican II is the recognition that we are a pilgrim church. On our way, getting there, probably going to stumble, going to make mistakes, have to learn. And it is only by journeying together, by listening to diverse voices, that we can be open to whatever is next. So we are just at the cusp now of stage 2. Stage 1, and you may have participated, those of you listening here may have participated in this at your parish or diocesan level, basically listening groups. All of that was packaged together, synthesized. I have my own criticisms of my own diocese on that issue. And now we're into step 2. And so we are going to have regional, national, and continental levels that make sense for geographic regions. And then the culmination will be the Synod on Synods in October 2023. So there are a lot of objectives in this, and I would recommend that you either do a screenshot or write down for a synodal church. You don't need the subtitle. That will get you to the Vatican document, which is guiding all of this. And notice that the words, participation, inclusion, opportunities for people who are not often heard, so that we can have the breadth and depth of gifts and charisms, and explore participatory ways of exercising responsibility. For me, Shakespeare says, there's the rub. And that's what I want to know. I want to know, will more laymen and lay women be involved in decision making? We're getting some of that with the group that the congregation that chooses bishops. These are important voices, but they're in extremely small numbers. So we want to ask now, how is power exercised in the church? How can we get rid of power and move toward authority and listening and inclusion? And so a lot of these words are obviously replicating. My time is short. I just want to say that Francis is not afraid of this process. He's not afraid of where this is going. And in the opening homily, he asked, are we prepared for the adventure? Are we fearful? He's not looking for the product. He's looking for the process. And in fact, as people in many religious orders, but the Jesuits particularly, will say that when a superior is talking with someone about what their next, say, assignment or ministry will be, the superior says, you discern, we discern, I decide. And let's remember that legally, the Pope is the supreme legislator. He is a member of the College of Bishops, but at the same time, he is also the head of the College of Bishops. That can lead, of course, to some tensions. And so he tells us we should avoid 3 risks: formalism, intellectualism, and complacency. We can call these up a little bit later, but I do want to get to questions. Because for Francis, reality is superior to ideas. He said it when Giselle Palmer in the Philippines cried and said, how could I be homeless? How could God allow me to be homeless as a child? And Francis threw away his prepared remarks and said, "There is no answer. The answer is the tears, and God weeps with the tears." As he put it, and puts it often, reality is superior to ideas. And so when people are asking if he's a radical or a revolutionary, I always say he's a radical moderate in a world where being a moderate is now a radical position. And so he's looking really at three opportunities. He wants to move toward a synodal church where the synodal church is the norm. A listening church is the norm. A church that stops wagging a finger, and a church that accompanies in what he calls God's own style, which is closeness, compassion, and tender love. How will this play out? We'll have to see. So now I think I and Dr. Darling Young would like to know what you think. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris and Robin, both for wonderful and very rich presentations. There's a lot to talk about, a lot of questions I'm sure the audience has. And so we're now going to turn to a time of conversation and question and answer. So for those of you listening, if you'd like to ask questions of either or both of our panelists, you can put them in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Type your questions and I'll find them and read them to our participants. But just to kick us off, I have a question for both of our panelists, which is about some of the tensions that Chris has brought up, that we have, on the one hand, councils, synods, where there's consultation and deliberation, and yet there's also a center and a decision. And so I wonder if you both could talk about this tension between reaching unanimity and then the very messy discussions that precede it.
I'm going to defer to Dr. Darling Young because she's the expert on the ancient world, and that was messy.
Well, I don't know that it was any messier than the medieval world or our world, but it is a very different world. And that's the interesting thing, of course, about the Catholic reality and Orthodox too. We preserve those forms which we inherited from the ancient world, the ancient political world. Why? Because the people who were competent to lead the church in antiquity were also competent to run various forms of government, or judged to be that way. So there was a way in which there was plenty of dialogue, lots of dialogue. A lot of it is not preserved. And I had mentioned that the notes don't preserve it. But on the other hand, even though it is strongly hierarchical, it was strongly hierarchical, there is communication. And I forgot to mention one important thing, and then I'll yield to you, Christopher, which is that there was a crowd in the ancient world that often expressed itself in acclamations. Our closest example might be some kind of a sports event where the crowd would either say yes or no. And those acclamations were taken seriously in the ancient world because, after all, a crowd turns easily into something larger and, having a certain decisive position. So these councils were run certainly by elite free males, did also know about what other people thought, and they took those things into account. But they also understood, and I'll stop with this sentence, or thought they understood, that the church had to have what they called homonoia, which means a common mind. And you arrive at that common mind by a process of decision, and then everybody signs on, not unlike our military. Okay, you, Christopher.
Well, I just want to add to that I think, Catholic amnesia and Catholic nostalgia, there's a lot of historical amnesia and nostalgia in many countries as well. We whitewash our past. We don't want to talk about the things that make us uncomfortable today, but all of the past is part of our past, and we have to embrace all of it. And I think that there is a richness in that diversity. I think that the difference is that once we reach that consensus, you discern, we discern, I decide, game's all, let's go. I don't have to agree with everything in my community, in my parish, in a family, but we do have to move forward. And that's what the early church especially was able to do when it reached that consensus. It makes me a little bit nervous that, if Tertullian had a Twitter account, we might be in a different place. And so you either agree to agree or you don't. And that's what makes me a little bit nervous about the process nowadays. And I think we gild the lily in saying that the early church was unanimous, because when you look at some of the votes, they appear unanimous, and we all say, come on, that's just not possible.
Great. A similar question, going now to some audience questions, is from Ray Lurie, who says, when we think of the history of councils, we often think of participation by non-bishops. For instance, Constantine largely directing the decisions at Nicaea, or the Emperor Sigismund at Constance, along with 300 plus scholars. Could you say something about the history of wider participation in councils than just bishops?
Which one of us? You want to talk about that, Christopher?
Well, let me talk about Constance, since I spend most of my time in the late Middle Ages, when there are three popes floating around. So the Council of Constance probably had the greatest concentration of minds before Vatican II. And we do know that there were lay people there, but remember that even lay people, because you had so many different layers of orders, would have had minor orders, and the minorest of minor orders, if I can make that word up, because they were studying in universities, and you would get very kind of low level, be a low level order for that. But certainly at the Council of Constance, there were, and I don't think I'm wrong in saying that there were lay people involved in the unifying election of November 1417. It wasn't just the College of Cardinals. So you had three papacies, you have three colleges of cardinals. There were also what we called nations, kind of language groupings, and whoever was elected pope had to have 2/3 of all of those different groups. And I believe lay men, again, elites, the point Robin is making, were involved in that. But everyone agreed that that was kind of not a precedent-setting situation, because you had the three popes. So there are some examples there.
Yeah, and I often a bishop would bring a talented scholar who might be, a consecrated a deacon or a presbyter for that purpose. So bishops often knew that they needed their experts, right? And they would bring them. And so, but in a court situation, and increasingly an ecumenical council would mirror a court situation, you really needed to have everybody in a recognizable rank. It's just how that world operated, with the great exception of the Armenian Church, which, thanks to the power of the lords of the various families, those lords insisted on representation by their guys who were not ordained. But that's unusual in the history of the church. I wanted to also mention, because somebody back in the Q&A asked about the councils of Persia. Yes, indeed, there were very important synods outside the limits of the Roman Empire. And indeed, when churches break away because of the decisions that they can't agree with, so for instance, the Syrian and the Armenian church, and for a time the Georgian church breaking away after Chalcedon, they run their own synods, because now synods are how the church is run. Usually, though, in deference to the most powerful bishop, the archbishop, or in the case of the Latin church, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope Papa. So there's there's still rank and ceremony are still extremely important in early Christianity. And I might add, it was also important at the Second Vatican Council. So it's something that's sort of woven into the church. Maybe it'll be different this time. I doubt it.
While we're talking about rank and ceremony, we have one anonymous questioner who asked about acclamations. So Robin mentioned that there would be those there who would shout or have vocal noises that would be votes. And so this attendee asks, but the acclamations of the ancient world often led to schism. The councils which led to Chalcedon serve one good example. What should we learn from these councils about the delicate balance between participation and ecclesiastical integrity?
Well, I think maybe it has been learned, actually, that the acclamations are important. They're an important signal of feeling and participation. But in the end, probably those who are in custody, who have custody of canon law, for instance, make the decisions. So acclamations are important, they're listened to, but in the end, in early Christianity, they weren't decisive. Maybe it'll be different this time. Probably. I mean, Christopher knows more about this than I do.
Well, I mean, I don't know, you know more about the ancient church than I do. I live in the Middle Ages, but I don't know that I would accept the premise that acclamation often leads to schism.
Oh, well, that was the premise of our
yeah, no, I'm not saying that was your premise. That's the question, and I don't know the answer.
Right. Well, I think there were acclamations that became the rallying cry of a group that eventually was either forcibly separated or separated itself from the church, say, at Constantinople. And those churches would either, they would either develop a parallel structure, or sometimes they would exist for a time and then be reincorporated, like the Arian church. So that's kind of historical differences, according to circumstance.
A similar question while we're talking about laity and acclamations is if there has been little inclusion of the laity over the centuries, as we've seen. I mean, some examples we've brought up. Beth Schweiger asks, if this is right, how did Pope Francis arrive at this current synodal form, in which, in other words, more laity are involved in the consultative and maybe deliberative process?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I think that I don't know his mind, obviously, but if you want to get as many people involved as possible, then the structure of dioceses is the way to go, because you already have a structure. And the way to begin is at the granular level by listening to people in parishes. Why reinvent the wheel? I think the question that concerns me, and to give you an example from my own diocese, and that is the person setting the agenda, right? This is an incredibly important role. So when all of the parishes sent their notices in to my diocese in Trenton, then in Trenton, somebody went through all of them and then came up with a summary. And from all of the comments, they chose to highlight what they chose to be representative. Now, I don't know whether they're representative of everyone or whether they're representative of that person's opinion, but one thing that struck out was a statement that said some people were concerned that others in the parish were raising their own agendas instead of talking about what the Holy Spirit wanted. Well, you're presuming that those two things are mutually exclusive, and I don't think it's your decision to make that. But a suggestion that somebody makes at the grassroots level could die right there if someone didn't decide to move that forward, right? And if you decide not to move that forward, you don't know whether there are 27 other such comments or 27,000 other such comments. And so you still, the question then becomes, who are the people doing that? Are they lay people? And if they are lay people and or clergy, they should deliberately be from across the ideological spectrum. This is Francis's model. You bring it all in and you throw it all against the wall. There is a consensus. And if there's not a consensus, then you decide not to decide.
And Chris, are there avenues for laity who will be involved in this later deliberations? So even if some of these are filtered out, as you were mentioning, and what role for the laity appears later in the process?
That remains to be seen. My own thought is that every diocese should have come up with, every diocese, and then the level that we are now, which is national, regional, based on geographic region, that the group should come up and say, this is what we think this group is saying. And then there should be a period for commentary, because that's where stuff could get called out. Mm-hmm. And then also there was a kind of international survey that was a technological disaster. It was hard to read. It was hard to click through. It wasn't clear whether you were on question 1 of 7 or question 1 of 23. And so I hope that there's a chance to make some commentary on that. As far as I know, there is no chance to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm interested if we could, Robin, if I could ask you about this issue of center and periphery in the early period, about what influence do you see from these local councils on general councils or other dynamics of movement from center and periphery that you find are relevant to this question?
Well, let's take the 4th century, my favorite. We know that local councils preceded the Council of Nicaea, right? So there was a council in Alexandria. There was a council in Antioch. The results of those councils were forwarded and included in the considerations of those bishops meeting at Nicaea. And once again, we have scribes and stenographers to thank for that. And we only regret that many of their records are lost. But again, that would have been a sort of microcosm, macrocosm thing where the local synod meets. Maybe they consulted people who were, not ordained. If they were, for instance, prominent citizens who also happened to be well educated, they might consult them. But the membership again would have been very limited. And then some of those people who had participated in Alexandria and Antioch, such as Eusebius, for instance, would have gone to Nicaea. So there was a sort of feeder system, if you like. But again, that as far as I can see, mimics the relationship of local government to central government in the Roman world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder, one of the attendees asked whether, or do you, the name is, I think Jovino Miroy asked, do you think political realities will influence how synodality will be conducted? And I was thinking of this question as I listened to you, Robin, and that the structures of the Roman Empire and its government give some direction to then how councils proceed in this local central movement. And I wonder if you two could comment on this connection between political systems and the movement of synodality.
Well, I'll just one little shot at this, and I'm thinking of the modern period now. The way in which political realities played out in Poland and in Eastern Europe generally certainly influenced how Pope John Paul II regarded councils and conciliar action, and particularly the desire to attract, and I don't think we often think about this, we think often enough about this in relation to the pontificate of Francis. It was John Paul who tried to wamp up the crowds and get them to communicate with him about their understanding of Christianity and their adherence to it, Catholic Christianity, of course, and their adherence to it. And then he would take that into consideration. And in fact, he made use of the International Theological Commission, which is a not only clergy, but also lay, and that continues to this day. So I think that the politics of Argentina, if we want to talk about, general politics, that has influenced how Francis treats the politics of the church. And it's interesting that we are still using the term, which is Greek, politeia, to understand the operation of this body, which in some way is influenced by and hopes to influence bodies that are not ecclesiastical and that we now refer to as secular, like national governments. So, Christopher, I pass to you.
I yield.
Okay.
All right. A few of the participants have asked about if either of you have any suggestions about different avenues that are possible for feedback. So one asked, besides educating about dialogue with laity, are there other kinds of possibilities or objectives or avenues where wider participants can connect into these synods?
Well, I think a lot of this is happening. I mean, whenever you have meetings in Rome, you have focus groups and groups that are trying to make a point about whatever their particular position is. There are lots of opportunities to do that through social media, through physically being there, through traditional activism of marching, having a rally. All of this is a regular feature now in our world, and has long been a regular feature. Remember that, to give an example, in 1378, I have to give historical examples. The first election of a pope in Rome in 75 years, the Bishop of Rome had been in Avignon, and the night before the conclave, the mob rioted, chanting that we want a Roman, or at least an Italian. So it's nothing new that crowds of people are trying to get their message out, and doing it in various ways. It's a matter of whether the decision makers, if those decision makers are only bishops, which would be a mistake in my opinion, are willing to listen. And I think certainly something that's happening in the United States, I think it's happening a little bit in Europe, I simply don't know about other parts of the world, are coming awfully close to schism. There's a difference between dissent and schism, and kind of every bishop is in charge of his local church, but they do so in communion with Peter. And I think I could I'm thinking of a number in the United States who forget that part, but in communion with Peter. Let's remember, there is no perfect system. The church is not perfect. The teaching is that the church is perfect. It is full of imperfect human beings. Well, if the church is made of imperfect human beings, then it can make mistakes. It can make errors, and we've seen it make errors. And if it can make errors, then it can correct those errors. So, while, to be clear, I am agreeing with the teaching that the church is perfect, the church is also imperfect at the same time, and that's not a radical position. You can find that in lots of church documents.
Oh. Great. Robin, anything you want to add on that?
I have thoughts, but I think that Christopher has summarized it very well.
Okay, great. Let's see. Maybe one question that we can end on is, since we have about 5 minutes left, so we may have time for one or two more questions, but to return a bit to the question about deliberation and consultation, could both of you talk a little bit about how this has looked different in different periods? I mean, what is there a role for a robust consultative party in different times in history?
Well, I look at the period when there are three popes in the Council of Constance, and it was very clear at the Council of Constance that the only way through this was to embrace the messiness. For those of you who don't know, in the year 1409, a bunch of cardinals got together and they declared each of the two popes, the Avignon Pope and the Roman Pope, deposed, and they picked a new pope. They went in with two popes. They came out with three. They acted precipitously. They didn't think things through. As soon as Constance came together in 1414, it was a clear decision that we have to move bit by bit, slowly, and reach as much consensus as you possibly can in a flawed world before moving on to the next step. And so, at the moment where the church is absolutely the church at the top, because the people of God are doing just fine, the church at the top is absolutely in the toilet. What saved the church was not centralization. What saved the church was communal action.
Robin, do you see similar dynamics in your period?
Well, one thing we haven't talked about, but that I think is really important, and it's sort of connected to what Christopher is talking about, is yes, there are bishops and councils, and yes, they make important decisions about doctrine and practice, but most of the, I wouldn't say most, but a large number of Christians in the period I'm familiar with didn't often see a bishop, and they would never have seen the workings of a council. They were instead consulting with other lay people who happened to be male or female ascetics, monks and nuns, in other words, who had a great deal of expertise in things that concern ordinary people. Like, and you can see this in a great book called, actually, I can't remember the exact title, but it's the Questions and Answers of Barsanuphius and John, where these are a pair of monks actually receive letters from people who are asking them questions, and they give very kind, very thoughtful answers to these people who are having problems. And there's a huge network in the entire Mediterranean world and beyond into, the Caucasus, Persia, and Ethiopia, of monasteries where lay people go and they can, they can have food, they can get health care, they can discuss their concerns. And that's still true in some parts of the Christian world. I'm thinking particularly of the Eastern Christian world, but there's also examples in the West. And it's been noted often by historians that the organization of monastic institutions, male and female, is a kind of parallel structure, which is very well organized, very synodal in some ways, but also generally open to lay people in the way that episcopal chanceries have not been for a long time, shall we say. So I think there is a kind of parallel structure. And actually, I'd be interested to know whether those groups are being consulted in the current move of Pope Francis to synodality. But I don't know the answer. I'd be interested to find out. But that's another aspect of Christian life that we often forget.
Right.
It's very prominent in those periods.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, mindful of the time, it looks like we're coming up at the end of our program. So thank you both for a rich conversation. Please join me in thanking Robin and Chris for all of their wisdom and wonderful comments. And I also want to say that we're grateful to the Lumen Christi Institute, the Nova Forum, the American Cusanus Society for co-sponsoring the series. We're grateful, for co-organizing the series. And we're grateful to our co-sponsors, America Media, Commonweal, and the St. Anselm Institute for Catholic Thought. You can join us for the next installment of this series on Thursday, September 15th, featuring Margaret Meserve and Rick Serena. Register today at the link posted in the chat. And you can find out more and support this series at www.lumenchristi.org. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thanks so much for coming.